We're flat out thrilled to host the inimitable poet, novelist, essayist, screenwriter, and commentator Andrei Codrescu in his only Northern California appearance, besides City Lights in San Francisco. 50 years ago, in 1973, Andrei fell in love with our exquisite West County. He found home here for 4 years with the river community of Monterio, finding it reminded him of his homeland of Romania. Andrei's career and person is impossible to compress into a few short sentences. He's author of over 50 books of poetry, fiction, critical essays, and commentary on art, life, and literature, averaging a book a year since his first publication, and is a 2-time winner of the Pushcart Prize. He founded the radical and crazy popular journal and blog Exquisite Corpse, a regular commentator on NPR's All Things Considered. He received the Peabody Award for the documentary Road Scholar, Coast to Coast, Late in the Century, an American road saga which he wrote and narrated. A recipient of the Ovid Prize for Poetry, the New York Times has called him one of our most magical writers. Now, throughout all these years, our longtime friend, poet Pat Nolan, and Andrei have remained friends. Pat himself is the author of over a dozen books of poetry and 3 novels. His poetry, prose, and translations have appeared in numerous magazines and anthologies, including the Paris Review, Rolling Stone, Exquisite Corpse, and more. He currently maintains 5 blogs, and a few among them Parole and Blog of the New Black Bard Poetry Society, now in its 10th year, and has lived in the Redwood Wilds along the Russian River for over 50 years. Who better than Pat to introduce his old friend Andrei and start the celebration? Following selected readings by Andrei and conversation between these 2 poet friends, we'll take a brief 15-minute intermission in the lobby. Refresh yourselves, visit, purchase one of the limited edition broadsides that has been signed, and we will then reconvene for a vigorous Q&A. So I give it over to you, Pat.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. I want to especially thank Suze Cohen and her wonderful staff and what she's doing with the Occidental Center of the Arts as a platform for local authors and returning local authors. Also, Eric Johnson, who printed up those really terrific looking broadsides. It was essentially my design, but Eric made it better. And thanks to Suzanne Lang, who I had that terrific interview with Andrei on her radio show, A Novel Idea on KRCB. Also to the good folks at the Bohemian for their terrific article, and also to Dan Taylor for his article in the Press Democrat. Does anybody read the Press Democrat?
Yeah.
Newspapers. We'll talk about that later. Where to begin? Well, I met Andrei in early 1970. He was living in San Francisco. I was living in Oakland, and I was running a mimeograph magazine, poetry magazine, out of the mailroom at Fantasy Records in Berkeley. Not long afterwards, I moved up to Sonoma County in the Russian River, and Andrei came to visit. He heard there were nude beaches. I couldn't confirm that. But he must have, caught the vibe, because very soon he moved up to Monterio. It was about 1973. and we became neighbors. We did neighborly things. We had parties, also known as bacchanals. We gave readings. We're poets, of course. We're going to give readings. We read each other's manuscripts, that's for sure, and each other's mail. We traded gossip, of course. That's the currency of the poetry scene. Who's doing what to whom, and how are they liking it? Most of the time they didn't. And we recommended poets to each other. Andrei is fairly well versed in American poetry for a guy who'd only been in the country about 6 years, maybe a little longer. And then we used to go check our mailboxes at the post office. It was in downtown Monterey, checking for fan mail and rejection slips. And Andrei got most of the fan mail. I got most of the rejection slips. And we would drink endless cups of coffee. I mean, endless. I couldn't do that any longer. At the diner at the Naughty Room in Monterey, which is no longer there. And we would have these long discussions on the things that were really important in the day, like what the latest film at the Rio Theater was about, or, what was happening in Tales of the City. Or was Patty Hearst's kidnapping a hoax? And on occasion, we could be found shooting a neighborly game of 8-ball at the Pink Elephant.
Oh, the good old days.
Yeah, it was fun while it lasted. And those times are often the store of fond memories and the makings of myths and legends. Andrei put the finishing touches to his memoir, Life and Times of Involuntary Genius, while he was living in Monterey from 1973 to about 1977. I read it in manuscript, by the way. It was thousands of pages long. Seriously, thousands of pages. Full of arcane knowledge and surreal speculation. A lot of surreal speculation. Andrei put his finishing touches to his memoir then, and I kept looking at it, and I realized that when it was published, only a small portion of that manuscript came out as that particular book, The Life and Times. Well, fortunately, the remaining material survived and was published as Monsieur Test in America and The Disappearance of Outside. So after 4 years in the Redwood Wilds, Andrei declared that some Jews were not especially suited for the bucolic life and moved back to the city. From there, he set out on his ever peripatetic quest for truth and knowledge and the answer to that perennial question, is there life after Monterey? Apparently there is. For a long time he found New Orleans more congenial to his cosmopolitan taste, and now he's back in Brooklyn. I know this, but maybe you don't know this. He's a recipient of the Ovid Prize for Poetry, the Heritage Award from the American Immigration Council, a National Book Award finalist, two-time winner of the Pushcart Prize. He received the Peabody Award for the documentary Road Scholar Coast to Coast in the late in the century, an American road saga, which he wrote and narrated, and is currently the subject of a documentary under production of his life as an immigrant, poet, novelist, editor, translator, critic, and keen-eyed commentator on the American scene. To say that Andrei is a prolific author would be an understatement. But I like understatement. I have in a 3-foot shelf in my office, in one of my bookcases, that I call the Codrescu shelf. All of Codrescu, it takes up, all of Andrei's books take up the entire shelf except for 2 volumes of Homer. Now, coming in the fall, Andrei will publish a novel and a book of poetry, and so I'm going to have to make room on that shelf. I don't know, it's either going to be the Iliad or the Odyssey, one of them's got to go. Did I try that one out on you? But most importantly, and I think this is Andrei's great contribution to the American canon, is Andrei's literary magazine, Exquisite Corpse, a journal of books and ideas, which was a distinctly radical entry into the conservative academic world of late century letters. I must have copied that from somewhere. Not only is it unique in its look and presentation, but it also, by being a prominent aspect of the avant-garde in providing inclusive platform for the largely unaffiliated national and international authors. Funny when you edit something as you're reading it. Also, as the editor of the notable late century poetry anthology Up Late, American Poetry since 1970, he spotlighted a cross-section of maverick modernist American poets, often ignored by publishers, marginalized by the Academy, and overlooked by the general public. And in his spare time, Andrei has taught literature and poetry at Johns Hopkins University, the University of Baltimore, and Louisiana State University. So even with this busy schedule, about every decade or so since his departure, Andrei cycles through the West County like a bad penny. He's just here to make sure that the trees are still standing, the river's still flowing, and his old friends are still kicking. I get a phone call, or an email. The prodigal is returning. There has to be a reading for old time's sake. Please welcome the prodigal penny, Andrei Codrescu.
Yeah, between our two.
Give me my water.
Yeah. Between our two memories, we're working out an actual story of how I got here. It really takes two to do all that. I remember that I came here to look for Pat, and he either wasn't home or hiding. I can't remember. And I waited a long time because I did want to live here, but then I didn't know anyone, and he was the poet I knew for some time, and then I came back. So that time it worked. Pat was home. And he was home a lot, actually. The sessions that we had then of reading, of talking in the coffee house were terrific. I remember those well because one of our friends, Jeffrey Miller, was also a contributor to him. Jeffrey died in a car accident here in 1977. The car hit a redwood tree on his birthday. What birthday was it? The 30th? And I just lost my appetite for this place. I mean, I didn't leave because I needed urban culture terribly, but it became depressing to be here. That was one reason. There were others, but that was that. And then I lived again in the Ozarks, on the border of Missouri and Arkansas for 7 years or so, and that was the country, and I mean, that was deep country. There were 2 caves there in this year around spring, and the only other Democrat in the county, Carl Jones, who lived about 2 miles from me. Sweet man, he and his wife sort of made it bearable, you know. So, and yeah, that was, I'm not sure what was more country, actually. I mean, this is more spectacular country, but that was a different sort of purple valley I lived in, where people, there were a lot of survivalists and people who went to caves to wait for the end of the world. And if their master or guru or prophet gave them the wrong dates, they usually either dispersed or committed collective suicide. I remember those are very odd days, and that the places had a magic too, that sort of surrounded all of that. So all the tragedies and the accidents and the prophecies and the crazy stuff going on simultaneously here and there, and became a big operation, which actually some people called Operation Mindfuck, which worked terrifically. I mean, maybe too well, because it overthrew reality as we knew it, and went directly to the new crazies on the right, the QAnon mode. QAnon? Yes. It's the same kind of storytelling, though, but it was from the right, because I think, you know, I mean, that really didn't matter what it was, but because it was a libertarian faction of one kind or another that had all read and rejected at some point Ayn Rand. So yeah, this stuff was going on at the same time, and then there were other things going on, like the poetry, and Pat and I, and we were going to talk about that a little bit, and the communes, Mary's commune, or the Angels of Light, came to a vacation from San Francisco, and they got tired of performing on the streets. So that was a very intensely interesting period, and it really took more than one person to keep those memories. So we get together now and then, and you know, there's nobody remembers the same things. So I thought I would read some poems from a new book of poems called No Time Like Now, and that's either ironic or totally so true that, you know, it's horrifying. Leaving. Give me a few minutes to get out of here. That was 50 years ago. Now, not everybody feels well. Or au contraire, one feels content, being a peasant, not a farmer, not a landsman, certainly not landed gentry, but maybe a wunderkind, a lover of insects and dirt, an ornithologist, a memoirist whose memory only worked uninterrupted by memory-making situations. Or not a return to the lander, or a reader of the Whole Earth catalog circa 1976, but maybe a contemplator of the animate and inanimate who takes time to observe things and creatures that prefer to be left alone unless you are feeding them. Not a poverty-stricken wretch who couldn't afford city rent, and when he had a day off from his job at the warehouse, hitchhiked to bumfuck and never came back. Not a cultivator of illegal plants who might have done better in the city where an excess of electricity might pass less noticed. And not an escapee from prison who equated wilderness with freedom, only to find that the local bloodhounds had data chips filled with scents and facial recognition for every escapee from the 20th century. Not the criminal in the witness protection program, because if you want my opinion, there isn't a place on earth where it's harder to hide than in rural America, where fresh meat is so interesting, the locals might give up hunting to find out why you moved and how you got here. Not a survivalist convinced that the end of the world meant the end of cities. Jesus, a carpenter, never considered, since he was a carpenter, always looking for work in cities, and made a splash before crowds in the capital. And most assuredly not a landscape painter who found it easier to paint vistas and milkmaids than Paris promenades and Pigalle dancers. But maybe a noisophobic individual who hadn't counted on cicadas, crows, coyotes, and thunder in the hills. Or simply an introvert sick of language who failed to express his inner inarticulate griefs and pleasures. A hermit, a mystic, a stargazer, a solipsist, a hater of society who saw no way to improve it. A child raised by the petite bourgeoisie of old Austria-Hungary who was ordered to never dirty his hands digging dirt or to use a table saw or chainsaw or any kind of small engine capable of taking off the fingers so adept at pounding keyboards and or blinding those eyes who are so clever at reading little magazines. Maybe I was some of those things and not the others. Trees are not people, but in their slow way they knew me and I them. And now I miss. I like to see people, the fast trees. I missed you people then, and now I miss the Luna moths on my screen door. So this is when I went back to New York, I lived in New York at the end of the 60s, which was also a wonderful time to be in New York because there's so many poets who are making a new kind of poetry. And we didn't need any money, really. I mean, $5 would buy a great grocery bag in the apartment with a bathroom and a kitchen. Well, not really a kitchen, sort of a kitchen. It was $60 a month in Avenue C. And now it's a place where 5 NYU co-eds pay about $1,500 a month each. And it's not any better, actually. It was cheap, and that's, it's impossible to have a thriving art scene or a poetry scene without cheap rent and cheap food. And, if you didn't like your apartment, you moved, you gave it up and got another one. And the same thing with food. I remember it wasn't too bad, to actually eat half of a bowl of brown rice and vegetables at the dojo in St. Mark's Place after the diner I had left. The whole bowl, of course, cost something tremendously expensive, like 65 cents. It was okay, because then you could talk to Ted Berrigan on the corner of St. Mark's Place and 2nd Avenue. And Ted Berrigan was an oral genius who didn't even notice that you were around. He would just talk. And the only time he could get a word in edge was if he smoked Chesterfields and if the end of his cigarette ended in his beard, then you'd say Ted. But what a thing, because Ted, is our incredible teacher, and to some extent, those poets are now established in the United States, the poets, the American poets. Anyway, so this is what Allen Ginsberg, of course, was around too, and I wrote this poem when I went back in 2016. And this is called The Revolution, Return to New York, for Allen Ginsberg's 92nd birthday. Allen, let's fix America. We're having a revolution, a marketing revolution. We're still in the wine, roses, goat, and sesame seed phase of the revolution, with a meat body full of unopened taste buds, waiting for the unborn entrepreneurs to open new fragrances to palates that won't die until we've tasted them. Our revolution will not stop for dead anybody, because the endorphin receptors multiply. There needs to be a lot more cinema and monsters, sliced thin in our glass cages, diddling echo, and maybe Eros. Any time now, art is just going to land inside and let us out. Flesh runs a smooth outfit here in the big city brain. I'm here for altruistic reasons, so deliciously selfish. I scream from when I wake up until my credit card expires. Yes, I am my credit card. I am American Express. I got shoved through the mail slot of a poet in San Francisco in 1971, who took me and 6 friends to an upscale seafood eatery in North Beach. I got caught up at the cash register. The raging cook with a bloody knife chased the deadbeats, one of whom tripped on her high heels laughing because she thought it was funny. 50 years later, we are still washing dishes to pay off our debt of wine and abalone. I wasn't amused. I was the first credit card, and I took myself seriously. I was the freest money yet to lead the future to prison. The drudges of the earth were a new market then. Our visionaries, God rest their souls, Henry Wells, William Fargo, and John Warren Butterfield sent their purebred dogs to work in the future. The priceless creatures of their brainstorm are now peas in the cups that move continually out of reach of the distracted proletariat. Even poets with their melodic rumblings did help keep eyeballs off the cups with peas in them. The world is full of distracting opinions and alarming events that give us license to plunder. In any language, even Pascal, which is not a friendly language. I rage at will even as I lie flat in a sweaty wallet. I drink sweat because my primal directive is thirst, and I drink hard. Even in the days of Wells Fargo and Butterfield, the yet non-existent heavenly MPAs dispensed gold coins that were not too dim to see. I wrote this from the bottom of the trash bin, where I feed until I am taken to the city dump and left to expire. Mr. Blake foresaw me in a dream, and he wasn't our first prophetic bard, but no one heard until now this rant from a cut-up Amex card. It's a poem on form, and it's a little prose essay on form, poem. On form. I know you hate the poignancy of last lines because they sound like class dismissed, think of the lesson. It's not multiple choice. That's because one expects the door out of the poem at the end, whereas it's at the start. You read it backwards and you are free just like you were before you came into this kind hell. There is no class, but the sonnet lurks somewhere like a naked woman behind the curtain on the 3rd floor of the building across the street. I caught a glimpse and I was happy. I didn't even think I was a man, proof to the contrary. I was a sonnet with a door. Unfinished line, you upset everyone, and it's a good day, whatever the lodgings. I'm just reading in order here, it looks like. But okay, and this is because of the wonderful broadsides that some of you have now. And I thought a lot about type, for sort of fonts and type. And I was reading, my good friend Alan Cornwall was my publisher in Minneapolis, was a collector of fine printing machines. And when I talked to him, we talked about type. But it is a concern if you write poetry, because you want the poem to take off, but you also want the type to be beautiful, but you don't want the type to be so beautiful that it erases the poem. What about humans changes like the type I type? Type changes for no discernible reasons. Humans die for reasons of space. Single space overcomes them. Once, double space wasn't enough to grow that silence poets employ instead of having something to explain crying or bafflement or the discomforting call to action. To care only between sunset and vampire hour is a gift from Baudelaire. Armies of sociopaths hold their hats to the closing of lines as if they were an ordered grid of stories they can claim they heard but heard never in. I can change all that. I'd rather not. Keyboards have their own agenda. It may include a sweet drop of you. It may be nothing but technology. Even so, something stays overnight, plays music, and is worth the sirens. These are sort of love poems, called If I Feel Anything Stronger Than This, I might have to have something stronger than this. Poison, or a seizure, or a slide down a forgotten insult to the island where those things are building courage to go out and be seen and easily become a nation. That is, to quote the enemy, quote, any community that contains in itself the ability to make war is a nation, unquote. If that is still the case, and it mostly is, I want you to let me out somewhere unsavory with a brown paper bag in the view. There must still be some of those places. That quote is from one of the Romanian ideologues of fascism, Andrei Codrescu. It was often quoted by Mircea Eliade, who was the founder of the field of comparative religion at the University of Chicago. Great writer, actually, unfortunately, politically worked and very much under the influence of Andrei Codrescu, who was a sort of another oral genius. He was a philosopher who only spoke, sort of a Socratic rant that he had going, and all the people of the 1920s, 1930s generation listened to him in Romania. Well, his philosophy translated into the writings of Nazis, sort of pseudo-philosophical Nazis, and you can trace this sort of Romanian mystical fascism directly to the war, to World War II and the rants of the Nazis. But they impressed an entire generation. And I saw the Romanian flag here. Thank you for actually wording define the Romanian flag. So does the Ukrainian flag. I mean, I see the sunflower too, which is great. But Romanian flag, I had one. I went to Romania to cover the 1989, whatever they were. It wasn't really a revolution. It was the troubles, as they call them. But I got there a flag with an actual hole in it. The hole in the flag became famous because the protesters cut out the socialist anthem from the middle of the flag, and they flew the flag from, when the soldiers joined them, they flew the flag with a hole in it from the tanks. And I got one that was actually bloody because people were killed. And I think it's in my archives. I gave an archive to LSU because I couldn't carry all this stuff around to Hill Memorial Library, and there were weird things there. And one of them was actually Steve Lavoie. Steve, you probably know J.J. Phillips.
Oh,
yeah. Well, J.J. worked at the library at Berkeley, right? And she had the Brautigan manuscript because she was caring for the Richard Brautigan collection, and one of the manuscripts had his brains on it because he committed suicide. And so, things like that with DNA, blood, DNA. But some archives are terrific. I should recreate whole soon, whenever they unfreeze Timothy Leary's brain. Which is in about 5 minutes. So this book was written again in New York. It was pre-pandemic, but there was stuff in the air. I mean, I could feel that things were going to go wrong, And then I had friends who said, well, there's going to be a virus. And I wrote a Romanian book then, and it was called Virus, and I didn't really know what it portended, but then somebody else said, well, last day of the virus, first day of the war, and indeed. So how time deals with the heart's annoying presence. Newspapers and screens where stories make their perch, extract for their food any heart that wanders through them, looking to stop hurting. They set it to work, ridiculing the tenderness it goes bong bong for. A poem, any poem, fights, but not very hard, to offer itself to other genres of expressive want, whatever they may be in that nameless future in clause 5 of any self-respecting contract. Hacks don't have aught to waste, fighting the melting ice cube, innocence. If you ever had any Mr. Heart, it is your problem now. Blame time, the automatic generator of stories that pass unheard by as you feel symbolic order, as by our pay as you feel symbolic orders. Confounded fools who pay for passing laughter, rolling out in wavelets and bangs like old hairstyles, pay for the tears in kiddie pools that take eternity to fill. The tough, and there are some, I meet them all the time, take the turn to hell slowly like clowns on unibikes, watching from up there the creasing flesh of strolling pedestrians on the low paper bridges of the books they've read. Who has the heart to see time cease, flesh crumple pages? The heart is not the post office box. There's never a check in it. The heart is a wound hiding in the wound, a wounded world. It jingles in its bells, rings, phones, dials the dead, and weeps. Then something makes it shred and shrivel, trying to keep up with the demand for sauteed spinach in the new house restaurant. Then something keeps time with money and has no time for that lost awe, and its tired, sentimental nudes speaking movingly to music at the beginning of the lyric mode. It even keeps time on its shredders and the internet, but it only looks fast. It's hardly quick about it. There are two kinds of something. One that was mostly crime, and the new spinach kind, shrinking in the hot grease of time. And let's see if I find something amusing.
Oh, man.
That's funny. All right. So, yeah, this is oh yeah, there's another sort of comment on the literature, but you know, it's called The Return of the Repressed in the Age of Avant-Garde Robots. What's that new AI called? TL3? PT3. Yeah, there is a new AI out there that will actually is an avant-garde robot because you feed it some text and you imagine that it will keep telling your story. And you're telling your it tells your story with your face on it. So this is a very, you know, I played with it for a minute and then just ran out and committed suicide. Creating and smashing ideas of high and low was a good business, but it cost followers much unneeded pain. They did get tenure, but at what cost? To take up gymnastics at their age was therapeutic, but not glorious. Still, that is the law of succession. First, the French have a good party, then the Germans clean up. Then the weather messes up the plumbing. Then the weather messes up the plumbing, and the proletariat rises again with tools. They were waiting patiently in the unconscious for transfer. I have no idea, transfer to what. Well, these poems sort of finish themselves, you know. You don't want to go there. There was an exhibit at the Jewish Museum in New York of Walter Benjamin's arcades. Walter Benjamin, a philosopher who never got out of Europe in time, a wonderful flaneur and fragmentary philosopher like Nietzsche and Cioran. And the Jewish Museum had an exhibit that took the arcades of Paris that he talked about and created the various kinds of scenes. And it wasn't a great show, but it was interesting. I liked this museum better when it was near the ruins of the Twin Towers just after Armageddon. Yeah, the museum moved now across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so it's a totally different place. I like this museum better when it was near the ruins of the Twin Towers just after Armageddon. It's uptown now, and it still smells of borscht, and it's nostalgic after Katz's Deli. It feels awkward among the Episcopalian Jews of the Met and the expensive doctors by the park. I was not looking for either my inner collector or my not-so-urgent inner Jew, but not too hard. I just wanted to learn the art racket that Kenny mastered somehow, and I also wanted to feel free and lazy like Benjamin probably never truly did in his day, but was now in vogue because straight lines are currently boring, and this is the future where everything is boring. I heard the bubbly guides losing her fizz trying to explain a bridge in the group photograph and how both bridge and group had been blown up and were no more. I walked through an arcade and I saw her standing among the handicapped, and I sort of woke up. The handicapped in wheelchairs are mostly asleep. Their guide would have gone through this group like a knife through schmaltz, but one guy was certain that the bridge is an object to be questioned. He was a nervous autodidact, born a Jew with a missing sense of humor, which is like being legless, which he was. He questioned the whole idea of the bridge that wasn't, but was all the same the show's centerpiece somehow. This attitude the guide in her modest guide outfit found insufferable. It was over her head and pay grade. Her agitation brought into sharp relief her life. For instance, a rope bridge, the guy said, how can I, an immobilized philosopher, pass over it? Even you who have legs, what would you do on a rope bridge? This is a job I can't handle, said the guy to herself. In this world of posters, buttons, and large black type, that was still too downtown for this point in her life. The young guy kept saying, rope, rope, and Jew, Jew, until one of the wheeled people said, a bridge is a means of passage over a ravine or over a river if you make it or not. Then she went to sleep, and I had no one to spectate. I spectated a worshipper of art until I was bored and needed coffee. She looked like the red fox with the bushy tail that sat on the grave of Karl Marx at the Highgate Cemetery in London a minute after the cemetery closed. I never got in, but saw through the fence the grave the fox sat on and thought, you see? Now this is a bunch of references, but this is actually what happened. I got there exactly a minute before and then after it closed. And it was the English way. It's closed. And then Karl Marx showed up. And I'm not sure why I was there, because I've been at the British Library before that and saw the table where Marx wrote Das Kapital, and then I visited Bram Stoker, place where Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, and then what else? And the place where Lenin worked when he was in exile from his first revolution in 1905 under a pseudonym. He worked in the British Library on a basic text of communism called What Is to Be Done. And so I was visiting the sort of radical celebrities, as one is wont to do. We were in the Côte d'Azur when COVID sort of lifted a bit last year, a year ago. And my friend Ivan had the exhibits in what was the place called? Jean-Cap Ferrat, yeah. If you have a big yacht, you probably know about it. It's huge boats that look like they belong to governments. They're just all sort of stolen loot from Russian oligarchs and other types of that sort. But anyway, we're there and I thought, what is there to do? And then we met a bored German guide, tour guide, and it was COVID, so she had nobody to guide. So we started talking. I said, you know, yeah, this is where Emma Goldman lived briefly when she was writing her autobiography. Peggy Guggenheim bought her a cottage on the Côte d'Azur, which now is all expensive villas and so on. So I wonder if anybody knows about this. Of course, it's not mentioned in any of the guides there. So the bored German tour guide made it her mission to find Emma Goldman's cottage. And so we ended up going to all these things. And then a friend of hers, a historian, sent an article written in Catalan by a reporter who had actually done the same thing. She looked for Emma Goldman's cottage. And it was terrific. I sort of made out the Catalan, and we followed her steps. Well, the funny thing was, too, that it mentioned the book I wrote, which is something else, but we followed her steps, and we found a place that was well guarded. So there's a guy with a gun standing in front of it. I said, and there was a villa behind it. I said, what's the story here? And he said, well, you know, there's this crazy anarchists come around, you know, for no purpose. Anyway, I don't know. She's buried in Chicago, if anybody's interested. When I taught school, I told my students they would get a good grade if they visited the graves of poets and people who somehow really pissed off the world. The way it was at the time. So, you know, they didn't have any money, so none of them did. But I did actually have somebody who visited Apollinaire, which is very much a poet's pilgrimage, right? That we take there. So anyway, I will read 2 more poems, and then maybe we take a break, and Pat and I will duel for poets must duel. It's a desperate art. Well, let's see. This is okay. This is called Melancholia, the Thing, and it is a poem for Lina. This is all I will read, actually. It's Melancholia, the Thing, for Lina Pasternak, and I wrote this on an island in Sweden. That had the, actually that's very appropriate because all people had to do there was watch Russian submarines pop up now. Thank you, whoever. Melancholia, the Thing, for Lina Pasternak. And he quotes a Romanian poet, Tudor Arghezi, which, niciodată toamna nu fu mai frumoasă sufletului nostru doritor de moarte, which translated is sort of fall was never so beautiful to our death, desiring soul, something like that. It's hard to translate. Anyway, people love your melancholia. It's not sadness, nostalgia, or regret. Dictionaries misname it, but it's a poet's pet. A secret that won't be a school, a movement, or a cult. It is in fact forbidden to bring it with you to school. We can never know your exact location, somewhere between growing heart, weather, and culture. Languages try to capture you. Nostalgia, Dor, longing, ansia, Sehnsucht, Verlangen, Dolu, Bramare, Langir, Verlangend, Heimleid, imposter words whose weight anchors you in a topos. You stay light and lightweight, a something that sighs. You are asocial, a threat to the buoyant state, but no friend of the suicide. The melancholic has a place of honor among the 4 temperaments. You may even show up in imaging or dissection, yet you are inexplicable, an invisible planet folded either deep in or at the far edge. Psychologists can't afford to classify you. You are too vague. You're not worth wasting a pill on. And unlike depression, you're not contagious, though you can make a room wistful for a minute with the bluish fog. What used to be so funny less than a minute ago? Buzzkiller. You are too much like that time between childhood and adolescence, both in and outside the old city, listening to the clock tower sound faintly, longing for something that will never happen. Melancholia, you are only consistent in that season. Now I am almost happy to suffer your vagueness, and I wish I can be still as long as you insist. At 19, you left me suddenly to enter someone else. You left behind some wretched gibberish. You took away some sweetness. Do I feel pity for the child you left me for? Not really. I can now watch without flinching the newly melancholized walk into the void. How can you envy the nouveau melancholic's cloud of sighs? I miss the you that made me sigh, not the you who stole away to make a new thief poet. The cloud of sighs drowns from its swallows, and to be frank, I don't care to feel that way again. You moved. You are no longer mine. Your autumn leaves were scattered by the leaf blower that hates actors. If I talk about you like a lover about a lost love, it is because I miss your nomad ways, your way of belonging to no one and everyone, an appendage to memory like Wordsworth's cloud. Never fully forgotten and never in a fixed orbit. You hide yourself and hitchhike back to that first waking of language inside a shy student. You are not a noun, my love, but you are palpable, an organ, a city, Sibiu, Visby, sights of beautiful slaughters, histories flow through your body of nothing. You have never acquired the real name in that immensity of time between adolescence and whatever this is. Sweat, nightmares, hives, fear of dark alleys, the fireflies that tiptoed on pimples and blackheads, the province of an age between ages, handing the still soft child to the hard-shelled alien now trying to put you in a frame. You're not even a word. In English, you are melancholy, not melancholia, a foreign film. My partner in void walking, I don't know why I bothered to put you into words, a subject without context, erased by the last century. Candy to a sad child, a lizard's head in smoky dives, a taste of death and funk. I don't know why I'm foisting you on company. I'm drunk.
So let's talk about something like how you came into my house this morning, early in the morning. I'd just gotten out of the shower. And you had already gone down, you already checked out the trees, they were still standing. You looked at the river, it was still flowing. You went and had coffee at Bartlett's, took a selfie of yourself in front of the pink elephant. And then you sauntered over to my house, and the first thing you did was, give me newspapers, and I thought, wow, how civilized.
You guys are 3 hours behind the real world. The stock market is go on, thousands of people are already killed, and everybody's sleeping. That's the story. I always think about that, because when the market's open, you have to be awake.
Yes, you do have to be ready, especially Bartlett's
no
market.
stocks at all.
Yeah, Bartlett's market. Price of coffee goes up during the day. That reminded me, that got me to thinking about that, and how when I first met you, and that your perception of where you were in this country was that of a civilized man looking at a wilderness.
Oh, that's nice. Right?
And of course, you come from the crossroads of civilization out there in the former Dacian lands, the crossroads of the world.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, this place is pretty amazing, you know. I wasn't really a tree hugger, because I noticed they don't hug you back. They're too big. Yeah, you know, but I know 100 years words of English. So I thought I could write, you know, a book. So, you know, I use them well here, but, you know, a lot of them, you know, I look at those stories and things I wrote here, and actually they have a feeling of the place because there were a lot of trees in there and all kinds of...
Well, something that always intrigued me was, were you a poet in Romania before you came to the States?
Yeah, well, Romanians like their poets precocious. So, at 16, I wrote a poem, and, well, maybe younger actually, and I asked my mother what the rhyme was for. I had an assignment in school to write a poem. Well, just give it, yeah, well, so we had to write poems about sounds animals make. And in quatrain form. And my mother was in there, and I was asking her for rhymes. You know, to what rhymes with frog in Romanian. Roscoe. And I wrote a great frog stanza, actually. The rest of them are not so good. And then the kid below me, who was in my class, and he was always getting first prizes for his writings, tried to buy the frog stanza from me. And he offered me this incredible sum of money. It was like 25 cents or something. And I didn't sell it.
But then you started reading poetry after that.
Then I got serious.
Yeah. And who were you, well, since this was a communist country and we have that image that, you know, a lot of information is suppressed, so who were you reading then?
Well, you know, when I started writing, there were two poets that opened up the scene for us. Before that, you could only write poems that somehow were about to praise the Communist Party, the workers, the proletariat. There were a lot of tractors in that. So anyway, so the official poets wrote these things that nobody really read, and they were on the front page of the newspaper, which nobody read. And then, you know, two poets. There was a poet, Nicolae Stănescu and Lavish, who were reading the French poets, because the Romanians always speak, well,
right.
Some of them do. And we were reading French poetry in some translations, but not, you know, totally. Then these two opened it up for us. Then I knew French, so I started.
Well, today I brought out a relic. It was a copy of an anthology called La Poésie Surrealiste, surrealist poetry, and it was one of the major anthologies to promote French surrealism, and you had picked that up in Rome.
Yeah, when I left Romania, my mother and I were in Rome for 6 months waiting for a visa to come to go anywhere, really. But the United States is where I wanted to come to, so I bought that. It has the date on it is March 1966, and I think that's the same month that we came to the US. And I also bought a Bible in Romanian, which was extraordinary, because they were completely forbidden where I came from, and I thought, this is amazing. You just asked for it and paid them. Well, actually, it was probably free, but it had a fine paper, and it was a wonderful 2 books. I bought the Surrealist Poetry Anthology, and I don't know how you got it. How did you get it?
Well,
It's my book.
that's a point that we have in common, is that we were both attracted to early 20th century French poetry, and not only the surrealists, but the Cubits, Apollinaire, Max Jacob, Pierre Lerdi, and then the Surrealists, of course. And that was certainly my grounding. When I discovered those poets, even though I was reading Rimbaud and Baudelaire prior to that, and Mallarmé, there was something about those poets that was brand new. And I'm reading these guys 50 years after their peak, but they still spoke to a particular kind of modern.
French was your first language, right?
The what?
French was your first language.
Yes, it was. It was. I spoke French until I was 10, and then I came to this country and forgot it all. But it's there by ear, and I know when I first encountered a dual edition, or dual language edition of French poetry, and I'm reading the English, and then I'm looking at the French, and I'm going, wait a minute, that's not right. And as I remember, it was W.S. Merwin's translations of Jean Follin, Transparency of the Word. And I'm going, wow, my ear is telling me that something's off with this English part. And of course I was wrong. Merwin did a terrific job on those poems, but I was hearing it differently. And being French-Canadian, there was always going to be a little something askew. And just kind of like American English is very different from British English. And so there's some of that. But yeah, we did translations when you were in Monterey. We did Max Jacob.
We did Max Jacob, yes.
Yes, and they were published in...
It was Picasso's roommate, actually. They shared the room and traded beds, because in the daytime one of them slept and the other one went out.
Yeah, we also translated John Ashbery.
We talked about John,
Well, obviously Andrei's forgotten that.
A very funny poet, Right?
Yeah.
This is like the guy who said, I was on the airplane and I said, this is so stuffy in here. He said, well, open a window. Well, the Romanian the weird thing about, some books I wrote is that the Romanian translations, I drive the translators crazy because I can read the translation. But I couldn't have written it. If I had written it in Romanian, it would have been that text. So, it's a real problem, but, I found finally somebody who got it. And,
So you came to this country and you didn't know much English?
I knew a sentence.
A little?
One sentence.
1 or 2 words, where's the bathroom?
No. My friend Julian and I made it up in Rome. We're both immigrants from Romania, and it was, why don't you kill yourself? So we tried it out. Really, we went to people, groups of people just hanging out and saying, why don't you kill yourself? They had no idea. Until we ran into these guys at the train station who actually thought that we're looking for those self-service machines that give you Cokes and things, and you put coins in them. And then I thought, when I came here, and I always thought I associated the idea of self with a machine that you put coins in. So you could be anybody or anything.
And so all of your poetry has been published in English. You've written all your poetry in English.
Some in Romanian, though, because it came back, so I get older, and suddenly I have this giant, burst of Romanian coming from somewhere. And, there's a Romanian philosopher, Cioran, who he is, Cioran, who didn't want to speak French after he left and went to Paris. He was in his 30s, he was very famous in Romania, he'd written these books, and he quit writing, reading, or speaking Romanian because of the politics. And when he became a great French stylist, he's considered a great French thinker and stylist, but when he got sick toward the end of his life for a year, he lost his French, and he couldn't speak with his companion of 30 years. He could only speak, the language had gone off, and he spoke Romanian, but he spoke a very vulgar and powerful Romanian of his 20s, of his years
But now that you've written all your poetry in English, it's being translated in Romanian.
Yeah, but I'm writing Romanian poems now, and somebody said, "Are you going to have this translated?"
Do you do any of the translation, or?
No, I wouldn't.
Yeah?
That's why I said I wrote them in Romanian. You can't
That must be
translate.
strange.
Yeah. Well, it's just, yeah, it's a little strange.
I've always had this, well, not a dream, but this urge to have my poems translated into French, and maybe
Not by
read
you.
in French Canada, like reading in Montreal or something like that. But I may be either too avant-garde or too après-garde, because I'm not getting any, nobody's interested.
Well, yeah, so do those, you're interested in Japanese art and poetry, and you've written a lot of Japanese-inspired
Yeah.
poetry, so did that get translated?
Yeah, well, I've translated my own poems into French.
Into
It's
French?
pretty bad.
Not Japanese?
Yeah, pretty bad. You know, there are so many subtleties, and I notice when I'm translating French poetry into English, I have so many ambiguities, and if the poet is using any kind of slang or idiomatic language, then you're just looking to get it. But
The great example for me of that is Barbara Wright's translation of Queneau's Exercice de Style. It's a paragraph that is written in French. The book is written Queneau is a French writer. He had took this paragraph and he passed it to every literary form known to literature, sonnets, dramas, epic poems, jokes, haikus, it's the same paragraph. It's a very banal paragraph. A guy gets on a bus and he loses 2 buttons. But there is one of them in which the guy speaks franglais. Franglais. So what Barbara Wright did, she reversed that.
Yeah, okay.
So her poem had a lot of French in it, I'm not sure. Franglais being, the latest French.
Earlier when I was talking about Exquisite Corpse, which was an incredible magazine, and you actually had offered a platform for a huge number of American writers, but also you publish a lot of international writers. And you started that, in the early 80s?
Yeah, we started that in the 80s, and it was on papers, it had a long
And there's, I have a copy of a Exquisite Corpse for those who have never seen it. And it's a very strange magazine. You wouldn't see something like this in the American newsstands or even bookstores, because it looks like this. And there's a story behind why it looks like this.
Yeah, there is. There's 2 stories actually. One is that it's a magazine that you could read in the subway if you're hanging from the strap. With one hand, is the way people will take the
In the subway.
and they will fold it. And then the other is that when you fold it, it makes exactly, for postage, cheap enough to send in bulk.
Yeah, I know.
Any other,
This is like the Rolling Stone of poetry or literary magazines in its day. This is an
And it has a
unbelievable-
very tiny type, and it's like Pravda, it's very tense and dense. And nobody could read it if you're over 30, because including myself, because it was, serious, in black and white.
Yeah, so this established maybe an alternative American canon, or alternative and avant-garde canon, because of how many people, the diverse breadth of poets and writers that were published in Exquisite Corpse. So you established a kind of ecclesia.
I guess, that wonderful line that Keith Abbott had in the poem. He said, whenever I hear the word avant-garde, I see TM right next to that.
But you follow this up though with an incredible anthology, Up Late, American Poetry since
It's
1970.
incredible because you're in it. It's incredible because you're in it.
Yeah, but again, you know, it was a groundbreaking anthology because prior to that, any alternative anthology would have been Don Allen, New American Poetry, and maybe followed by Shapiro, Paget, New York Poets, and then Andrei's anthology, which also tracked, you know, a divergent literary stream that just wasn't getting the attention in either mainstream publishers or in the academy. And I remember one of your comments in the contributors' notes was that there were a certain number of people who were known as the California School. And that included me and Keith Abbott and Steve Lavoie and a number of other people. And I kind of hijacked that phrase and made it the California School of New York Poets. Because, yes, we were living in California, but a lot of our aesthetic reference went back to New York City and poets like Ted Berrigan, Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, Jimmy Schuyler. And so a lot of us in that anthology were writing in that tradition.
Yeah. Should I ask, get some Q&A, get some questions from the audience?
You know, I didn't hear a thing you said.
I said, let's get some questions from the audience. Yeah, let's do that. So, anything? Yes?
So they can see people in the audience.
It's available from rare book dealers. Everybody in that anthology actually became quite well known. I mean, you know, anthologies are a funny thing because there was a certain time when you couldn't anthologize things anymore because the poems are not the size of the
page,
of the page. And so poems, longer poems, shorter poems, poems that played with things. But you know, I mean, it was very difficult doing that. And what happened is, when you compare the anthologies, when I did that, was it Up Late? There were 150 poets in it. And my colleague at LSU across the hall, a guy named Dave Smith, he edited the Norton Anthology of younger poets. And the extraordinary thing was that there was not a single poet that in both books. And yeah, and I thought, well, I first thought this is really interesting. It's an aesthetic choice, you know, and it was an aesthetic choice for me. But you know, his was more, you know, every poet in his book had 2 children and translated from one poet and taught in a university, which was, you know, I mean, just that may have been coincidental, but really there was a you know, a clash there, you know, kind of a trench through the middle of American poetry that is still here, you know, so. I mean, we could discuss this forever because we did. But yeah, that was very odd. But then if you look at Dave Smith's anthology, a lot of those poets are not around anymore. So, you know, my sense was that about 70 to 80% of those poets you won't hear anymore. Whereas the Up Late, I'm proud to say, actually, almost everyone continued being a poet. And that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, to start writing poems in your 20s and then, you know, just write poems until you know, you get old writing poems. You know, this is really an insane thing to do. So all the insane people are in that anthology.
Right, well, you know that old saying, if you can't beat them, outlive them.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Somebody has a question.
Yeah.
Somebody's waving their hand.
Dana Gioia wrote a book called Does Poetry Matter? And do you feel that you had more impact in terms of mattering in your radio program than you do as a run-of-the-mill published poet?
Well, not run of the mill, I wouldn't say, but I would.
An extraordinarily exceptional published
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those commentaries on NPR were contained about up to 20% poetry occasionally, or 30%. Particularly, it's like alcohol or beer. So they were finished sentences, that had some poetry in them, and there were millions of people listening. So you had, when the NPR started, I started at NPR, they had about 6 million listeners, and when I left, they had 23 million people. And then I thought, and they're still paying me $100 a piece. So, but that's okay. They keep begging you for money. They became good beggars. But yeah, I mean, of course, people are, and they're somewhat subversive, those things, because I always tried to have a fresh idea when I was writing them. They were weekly commentaries, and I would sneak things in there that the producers wouldn't hear. I mean, they got so used to hearing me speak that they just didn't catch them. And then, but of course, the listeners would, At some point, I said something about the rapture, and they got 30,000 postcards that came, or letters from churches and people outraged by my comment, but not a few of them had heard the commentary. It's just taken totally out of context by, what's his name, Ralph Reed, who was then the leader of something called the Silent Majority. And the silent majority was now the loudest minority.
The proper nouns are the first to go.
Yeah.
And the improper nouns. I'm waiting on those.
Well, it's a good medium, radio, it's great because everybody thought it would just disappear, but people like listening to stories, and they like, and there was a character to the show in the beginning, which was like a magazine, it had like all sorts of, they had some funny things, they had commentary and so on. And now they've become much more a mainstream news organization that's, that pays people.
We were taking questions. Gentlemen up there?
Yes. So your native language must be Romanian, is that correct?
Well, that's my third language, actually, because I spoke German before going to school with my mother and the Fräulein who took care of me when she was at work. And then I spoke Hungarian with a friend. And then in school, I started, Romanian, but I didn't know they're separate languages. I just thought that's how you talk to Peter, and that's how you talk to my mother. And then in school, they told me they were different languages. My brain froze.
Okay, well, here's the question. Which of these many languages do you prefer to write poetry in? I mean, each language has its own way of doing things, and some are...
It's true. You have to know all the languages.
You do?
Which is possible. There's a tunnel under the languages. Seriously, there's a tunnel under the languages, and you can travel from one to another. All it takes is just open up to it. I spoke Japanese one time on acid. To somebody, to a Japanese person. We understood each other perfectly.
That's a great answer, thank you.
It's there.
Well, at least you were able to speak your language on the playground in school. I know growing up in French Canada and the insistence on my father that I go to English-speaking schools. And so we spoke English or, code switching in the house, but then we had to speak English at grade school. And it was verboten to speak French on the playground, and all my friends were bilingual. So, it didn't matter, we could say something in English, we could say something in French, it was the same sentence, so that, but, you caught speaking French on the playground, you got that strap.
Yeah, well, the French in Louisiana, the Cajuns, were in the same, situation there. It was considered, not a language. It wasn't allowed to speak it in school. But then the French, the Alliance Française, is one of those organizations that promotes the French, from France, started publishing a newspaper there and really bringing back the Cajun cultures. Now it's one of the greatest things about Louisiana. That French is,
Yeah.
particular French is a medieval kind of old language. It's widely.
I wonder where the name The Exquisite Corpse came from.
It's from the Surrealists, André Breton and Philippe Soupeau. Collaborated on a poem, and one of them wrote a line and folded it and left a word for the next person. And then they folded that and they left a word. And then at the end, you just unfold it and read an X-ray of the collective mind, and any number can play.
It was something that the Surrealists developed, though it was an old party game.
Yeah, cadavers.
Sometimes it was language, and other times it was just a line. It would become a drawing.
Because of the paper size of the drawings, I saw a great exhibit in New York of the corpses of that time, and they were all bodies, turned out to be, because of the paper, which sort of led you, if you had found the line, you would just keep...
Yeah, and the Exquisite Corpse has really lived up to the name of that game, actually, because there was such a different, wide input.
Well, they liked it. This was a Dada thing as well as a Surrealist thing, because they liked playing games, and they're really the preeminent art form of the first half of the 20th century was collage, because both Picasso and Braque put in pieces of newspaper or things they cut out from various places. And the amazing thing about that is that if you look, at the events of the day and you wonder what happened in that day, it's forgotten. So you don't remember it, but if it's in a painting by Braque, you can go to Christie's and spend a few $1 million.
And the collage was developed right around the time that the cinema was taking hold.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you watch the cinema, even though it seemed like a succession of images that followed, they were actually separate images. And so that idea that you could chop something up and put it back in a different order and still have something that works, that is aesthetically pleasing, essentially may have been due to the popularity of the cinema. Blaise Cendrars was a cineast.
Well, that was the new...
Everybody loved the movies back in those days, and the Russians were using stock footage to make their propaganda during the Bolshevik times, and they mastered and actually
they pushed it down on our throats.
originated a lot of the techniques that were later used in film editing.
Yeah. Well, the constructivist school actually, some of them, made propaganda, but a lot of them were sent to the concentration camps by Stalin, who changed that, style of propaganda posters and art into this so-called socialist realism, which was supposed to be about tractors and heroic workers. I like especially heroic workers in the 5-year plan.
Go ahead.
I was wondering if you still keep in touch with poetry circles in Romania.
Yeah, very much.
What do you make of it?
I think it's a very rich scene, actually. There's a lot of terrific poets. Are you Romanian?
Yes.
You write?
Occasionally.
Yeah. No, I think it's terrific. So do you keep, I read, Dilemma I read because it's, also has essays and politics in it, but I also read the literary weeklies or monthlies when they come around. In New York, the Cultural Center has been bringing poets there. So who do you talk to?
It's mainly people that I follow on Facebook, and they publish their poetry.
Facebook is a big deal in Romania, actually.
Still, yeah.
Well, people like Andrei Codrescu, who's a well-known poet and writer, basically his posts on Facebook become the stuff for the newspapers. The newspapers headline it the next day. It's strange.
Wow.
But still, Romanians are, it's still a well-regarded art, so terrific. I mean, poets in this country, I think, have sort of like just below janitors. I'm not nothing against janitors. I'm just saying it's not. I was looking for a politically correct profession to this, but you can't do that anymore. Yeah, it's they are still very highly regarded. It's okay to be a poet. It's okay to act funny and write good things. All we do, and not to have a job, although most of us do or did.
What's your job now?
It's talking. Writing, talking. What else do we do? Let's see, what do we do? I mean, I don't really have any interest in. I go to a lot of art shows and look at them and say mean things. Linnea has been dragging me to avant-garde concerts of music.
My hearing
It's
ear
okay, but I
companion.
didn't say anything. Not important. He called me a mumbler today.
Yeah, I know, I know. Yeah. And he has an accent that even makes it worse. But yes, I remember visiting you in New Orleans, and then we had to go to LSU, where I spoke to your classes on French poets. And then afterwards there was a faculty reading, and you were the main speaker. And we ended up in a bar, and I was playing pool, but Andrei was playing the one-armed bandit because that's legal in New Orleans. And so kept looking at the watch and going, Andrei, you're late, you better get over there.
Well, there's a river, of course.
So we were late, and we, walk in there, it's a room like this, full of people waiting for Andrei to speak. And they were getting a little steamed. I mean, you could just see these white-haired matrons and, the faculty wives and stuff like that. They're looking in their chairs, looking around. Andrei walks in, there was a buffet. Oh, yeah, salmon, canapé, that's good. Walks up there and he says, hey, terrific salmon canapés. I'm going to talk about New Orleans, don't mind the accent.
Yeah, well, those are the days where you could do that. You could say anything really, and you could take a sentence and dissect it. Or a canapé, for that matter. I mean, teaching was great because I could just talk for an hour and nobody said it. I mean, there was a whole sort of, I suppose that was a, sort of a Heideggerian, and also Deleuze and Derrida's school of like saying interesting things if they happen to pass through your mind. Students are great that way because they feel like you're speaking a foreign language, and now and then they would wake up. So yeah, I mean, it was great being a young poet. I mean, we worked, right? I mean, that's all we did. This was work. I mean, I tried. I had the workshop. I had the wood shop actually in the country, and I learned how to do a few things from this guy who was great at making all sorts of things. And I thought, I don't make things with my hands. But he was the wrong guy to learn these things from. He never used any safety, any protection. He put his hand right next to the table saw like this. He was missing a couple of fingers already. I said, maybe I should just, I had 2 chainsaws at one point. I was cutting things and I fell down and just threw them away after they're still going. And so, I don't know how to do anything else.
Somebody had their hand up here for a long time.
A I'm sorry. Yeah.
Bathroom or they have a question?
One year,
How old were you when you left Romania, and what are the
I was 19.
okay, and what are the circumstances like? I mean, I'm guessing not everyone could leave, so how, wherever it was.
We were bought and sold. The state of Israel paid $2,000 for Romanian Jewish ethnic Romanian Jews. West Germany did the same thing for the German communities. The German government was paying to, one way to put it really was to buy our freedom, because basically that was it. And I was very happy to go, and my mother and I cost us $4,000. I think it was more if you went to college. Your education, they added $1,000 to that. So all that money went into the dictator's secret accounts in Switzerland, and so very few people knew about this business. The dictator at the time, this was started in the old dictators, Gheorghe Odej, and it continued through Ceausescu, who was killed in the revolution, or the troubles. It was a good thing because we could quietly leave. On the other hand, there was no protest movement the way there was in the Soviet Union when the refuseniks actually made a stand, a political stand, and went to prison and to the camps for their protests. So, in a way it was unfair for us to be able to leave quietly. But, I was 19 years old and I couldn't wait to get out of there. So we slipped through to this dirty deal that the dictator had with Israel and West Germany. Yeah.
Do you find poems that you've written that you love dearly and poems that audiences go, oh, and how do you have these private loves for some of your writing, and yet what people love can be very different?
I don't like it. I mean, for me to write is to get rid of stuff, right? I mean, obsessions, or even it's a way of actually emptying your mind and whatever, and then giving it to the people to deal with. They say, now it's your stuff, so you to make what you will of it, you got to make room on the drive, right?
No. The main idea that you have to realize is that you don't want to write about anything. You write about nothing, and maybe eventually you'll get something. There's a formula for poetry. It's pi, P-I-squared-E. Personality, imagination, and intellect combined together have innovation. And the E is for experience, and you have to have all those. And so you have to write constantly. And once in a while you'll find something and you go, hey, that's good, I wonder if I wrote that.
Yeah, I don't feel the same way. I don't think intelligence is particularly required, What was the first one?
It was what?
P. Personality. That had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, personality. You have a personality.
Yeah.
Not a good one, but it'll pass.
Everybody has a purpose. They hand it to you with when you put your coins in the machine, you get a self, right? So if you don't like that one, you get another one.
Yeah, exactly. You have to have more than one.
Yes.
read this.
Do what?
Oh, read it for us.
Oh, the poem? Sure, I was just thinking that I was back in the country and I found a pastoral poem. A pastoral. Which is something that happens with sheep in the country. Pastoral. I will read that poem too, but it's a pastoral. I live in the woods. This is different woods, but there are woods. I live in the woods. I wrote a poem here actually called The Trees May Be Scary, but Your House is Among Them. I live in the woods. I have no change in my pockets. I never jingle coins. The extortion machine called city peddles sugar and turns big hills into small coins. I have no change in the woods, where change is a constant. I'm too slow to know. I'm the jingler of unseen change. On the next hill over lives the keeper of rhythm and the drummer whose beats are in my heart. One is a boy, one is a deer, and the third is an oak. The collector has no fixed address, but when he shows up, you better lay down that axe. Address him as Senor Death. He comes for the 3 tax. Yeah, I don't know that one. I don't have it.
This one?
You okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. You okay? Everybody's okay. Oh, there's that poem. That poem.
The poem you printed.
Hey, it looks like it's a great looking design.
It is. It's beautiful, actually.
I wonder who did
Well,
that.
it's become a real thing, now, because people can frame them and put them up as opposed to books, which are kind of big, just too many words now. Yeah, it's a really beautiful job. Did you give these?
Yeah.
Eric Johnson of Iota Press and North Bay Letterpress Arts.
Yeah.
They are so awesome.
Well, there's a backstory to this, which is that I know this famous hacker, Pablos, who's going to jail, and then he's working for Microsoft instead. And great guy, so totally brilliant. And he sent me a Christmas card one time, I had a key in it, and I just, I said, well, that's nice, and I put it with all the other stuff there. And then my friend Linda Stone was working at Microsoft, and she said, what, Pablo sent you a key? I said, yeah, what's about this key? He said, that's a key to everything. It's the key that opens any door. I said, well, what is it? He said, they actually made a metal that takes the shape of the keyhole. And even a Yale lock, whatever lock it is, and it will open. And so I just looked frantically for it. I couldn't find it. Got lost. So that's why this is a fairy tale for Pablos, who's the internet is the revenge of the latchkey kids. And now who needs a key? What is a key? Your finger is a key, your eye. A key that look is that key. And if so, the door it opens it to the many doors in this body, including the heart, which is one key to this person. I am a mansion, so I have many doors. Just like Jesus said, his daddy said, to impress the girls in the movies. Listen, Escher is coming upstairs. The body dictates, the brain takes notes on the body with the index finger. The body is dictating the internet fairy tale called The Revenge of the Latchkey Kids. A story that has no choice. The heart, the front door, sounds the alarm every time this finger touches a letter.
Wow.
I'll give it back to you. I promise. So yeah, you guys did a great job. So Pat also does an amazing series of prints, block prints of poets, and it's a terrific.
The Smoking Poets series, yeah. I discovered that a lot of poets, photographs of poets, they've got the cigarette. I mean, this is a past generation. Nobody smokes anymore.
Well, everybody used to smoke on book covers.
Yeah.
Maybe they smoke on the East Coast. That's why we're so healthy out here on the West Coast.
No, this is a long time.
Yeah.
You are more.
But yeah, so that's one of my little projects that I do now. Block prints of smoking poets. I just finished doing a couple of the French poet Philippe Soupeau, who was one of the founders of Surrealism. He, Louis Arcan, and Andrei Breton were the ones that founded Surrealism, and Suppot and Aragon wrote Les Champs Magnétiques, the magnetic fields, which was one of the early surrealist texts. And that brings up an interesting idea. Remember when everybody did collaborations? We used to do collaborations all the time.
I still have a lot
A
of.
poet would show up, we put the typewriter out, put a sheet in it, and, as the party went on and stuff, people would add their 2 cents worth, kind of an exquisite corpse in a way, but, you could read what was going on. And collaborations were a big thing, a big part of the New York school.
Yeah, well, it was a sort of a community-making tool, because you wrote it together, and then, you talked, you drank, these things went on, and then at the end you had this kind of record.
Yeah.